What happens when a pop icon's past collides with present-day scrutiny on live television? Well, you're about to find out. Because what went down between Gwen Stefani and George Stephanopoulos on Good Morning America was nothing short of explosive. This wasn't your typical celebrity interview meant to promote a new album or tour. This was a full-blown confrontation that left viewers jaws dropping and sent social media into a frenzy within minutes. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And by the end of it all, Gwen Stefani was storming off the set, leaving George Stephanopoulos and the entire studio in stunned silence. The morning began like any other at the Good Morning America studios. Gwen Stefani was scheduled for what everyone believed would be a routine, upbeat interview about her latest music, her creative journey, and upcoming collaborations. She walked onto the set radiating confidence, dressed in a striking black and white outfit that perfectly reflected her iconic style. Cameras rolled, the studio audience applauded, and George Stephanopoulos greeted her with his familiar, polished smile. "Gwen, it's wonderful to have you here," he said warmly. "You look fantastic as always." "Thank you, George," Gwen replied, settling into her chair with ease. "It's great to be here." At first, everything unfolded exactly as expected. They talked about her return to solo music, her passion for songwriting, and how it felt reconnecting with fans after years of focusing on collaborations and television appearances. Gwen appeared relaxed and animated, laughing easily and speaking with enthusiasm about creativity and self-expression. The audience was engaged, hanging on every word from the pop star they had adored for decades. George referenced her new single, climbing the charts, and asked how it felt stepping back into the spotlight on her own. Gwen's eyes lit up as she spoke about music being her first love and how meaningful it was to express herself freely again. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on fashion, family, and her experiences mentoring young artists. It felt safe, familiar, and celebratory. Then, without warning, the mood shifted. George shuffled his notes and looked up with a noticeably more serious expression. His tone changed, taking on the edge of an investigative journalist rather than a morning show host. "Gwen, I have to ask you about something that's been making headlines recently," he said. Gwen's posture subtly stiffened. Her smile remained, but something in her eyes changed. "Of course, George," she replied carefully. "What would you like to know?" In that moment, the atmosphere in the studio quietly transformed, setting the stage for a confrontation no one had anticipated. George began referencing resurfaced interviews and commentary from Gwen's past, particularly focusing on her early 2000s aesthetic and branding choices. As he spoke about cultural imagery and fashion influences, the studio seemed to grow colder. Gwen listened intently, her expression tightening as she realized where the conversation was heading. He mentioned criticism surrounding her Haruka branding and the way Japanese culture had been incorporated into her music, fashion, and public persona. Gwen paused before responding, choosing her words carefully. She explained that her interest in Japanese culture came from a place of admiration, curiosity, and genuine respect. She spoke about traveling, learning, and being inspired by what she experienced. But George didn't let the explanation stand on its own. He pressed further, pointing out that many critics argued there was a difference between appreciation and appropriation. He referenced past comments, branding decisions, and the financial success tied to those cultural elements. The tone remained professional, but the questions grew sharper. Gwen's body language changed. Her hands clasped tightly in her lap, and her voice took on a defensive edge. She insisted that the performers she worked with were collaborators, not props, and that they were treated with respect and fairness. She denied ever claiming ownership over Japanese culture or presenting herself as its originator. George countered by noting how deeply those cultural elements were woven into her brand, and how profitable they had been. The perfume lines, the visuals, the fashion, all of it had generated enormous revenue. Gwen's composure wavered as frustration crept into her voice. "I came here to talk about my music," she said, clearly irritated. "Not to be attacked over things from 20 years ago." George responded calmly, saying these conversations were still relevant and that public figures carried responsibility, along with influence. The audience sat in uneasy silence, sensing that this interview had gone far off script. Gwen accused the segment of feeling like an ambush. She emphasized that the interview's agreed focus was her current work, not a re-examination of past controversies. George remained unshaken, pointing out that recent social media posts had reignited the discussion and that her platform made these questions unavoidable. That was when the tension truly ignited. Gwen leaned forward, her voice rising as she defended artistic freedom and the idea that creativity thrives on inspiration from the world. She argued that art should not be confined by rigid boundaries, insisting that expression and influence were universal. George listened, then challenged her again, asking whether profit and power changed the ethical equation. The exchange was no longer an interview. It was a live, unscripted debate unfolding before millions of viewers. As the discussion intensified, the conversation shifted from specific branding choices to broader issues of privilege, power, and accountability. George carefully framed his questions around systemic inequality, emphasizing that artistic freedom does not exist in a vacuum. Gwen bristled at the suggestion, her frustration now unmistakable. When George referred to her position as a white artist benefiting from privilege, Gwen reacted sharply. Her voice cracked with indignation as she rejected the label, insisting that her success came from hard work, rejection, and years of struggle. She spoke passionately about her upbringing, the obstacles she faced, and the effort it took to build her career from the ground up. George acknowledged her struggles, but calmly explained that personal hardship and systemic advantage could coexist. His even tone only seemed to inflame her further. The studio was utterly silent, the tension thick enough to feel through the screen. Gwen stood up abruptly, shocking everyone in the room. She accused the show of misleading her and turning a promotional appearance into a public interrogation. George urged her to sit down, emphasizing that the questions were legitimate and deserved honest engagement. Instead of calming down, Gwen's anger escalated. She accused him of disguising accusations as questions and attempting to force her into apologizing for her entire career. Her voice echoed through the studio as cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of the unfolding confrontation. George responded that he wasn't asking for an apology, only acknowledgement of concerns raised by members of the Asian American community. When he referenced a past quote describing performers as accessories, Gwen snapped. She pointed at him, accusing him of chasing a sensational moment rather than understanding context. He pushed back, quoting her own words and asking how they could be interpreted any other way. Gwen insisted it was playful language tied to fashion and performance, not dehumanization. She described those performers as friends and collaborators, accusing George of twisting her intent into something malicious. The exchange grew sharper with every sentence. George questioned how identical styling and constant proximity might appear to those from the culture being represented. Gwen defended the collaboration as a celebration of global influence, insisting that this was what art had always done: blend, borrow, and evolve. Then George asked quietly, "At whose expense?" That question landed like a blow. Gwen froze, then erupted, pacing behind her chair, as she accused him of reducing her life's work to cultural theft. Her voice trembled with rage and disbelief, as she rejected the idea that her art was a costume or exploitation. The final moments of the interview were nothing short of chaotic. Gwen's anger spilled over as George continued urging her to consider impact, alongside intention. Each mention of privilege seemed to push her closer to the breaking point. She shouted back, saying the word was being used to invalidate her sacrifices, her talent, and her dedication. George tried to clarify, explaining that acknowledging privilege didn't erase effort or success. It simply recognized unequal barriers faced by others. Gwen wasn't hearing it. She accused critics of jealousy, resentment, and manufactured outrage, claiming they wanted to tear down anyone who succeeded. George firmly rejected that framing, emphasizing accountability and listening when communities expressed harm. Gwen demanded to know how anyone could be hurt by her love of culture, her music, or her fashion. She called the backlash exaggerated and insincere. The journalist countered by pointing out the consistency of the criticism, coming from scholars, activists, and members of the community itself. Gwen's face flushed, her eyes glistening with anger and frustration. She said she was tired of being told how to create by people who didn't know her intentions. When George replied that no one was policing her creativity, only asking her to reflect on its effects, Gwen let out a bitter laugh. She declared that her impact had been joy, unity, and celebration, and that apparently, it still wasn't enough. That was the moment she grabbed her purse. With a sharp movement, she slung it over her shoulder and announced she was done. She accused the show of ambushing her with political correctness and humiliating her for ratings. George stood, calling after her, insisting the conversation mattered. Gwen didn't stop. As she walked off the set, heels striking the floor, she declared she would not apologize for being an artist or for finding inspiration in beauty. She accused the show of trying to destroy her reputation and refused to participate any further. The cameras followed her exit as the studio sat frozen in disbelief. George's composure finally cracked as he called out her name. But she was already gone. What had begun as a routine morning interview ended as one of the most explosive live television moments in recent memory, leaving viewers divided, social media ablaze, and a lingering question about art, accountability, and where the line is truly drawn.